Yeah, gotta aim for the top like, hold up. Yeah, I can never doubt myself, I know better. All of you critics be acting like you know better. Blowing the smoke, but I know when the dust settles that I'm in my element. It's evident that there's levels to the game.
What's happening, people? Welcome back to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Holmes, and I am joined always by co-founder Reed Meyer. And today we're going to dig into the NCAA's new study on widespread social media harassment of athletes, coaches, and officials. And this study was released back in October, and it went through and did a number of research on how social media has really impacted, or at least taken the numbers way up through the roof when it comes to harassment with these athletes, specifically the athletes. And, obviously that's what we focus on here at Athletes. So even though there will be some things sprinkled in here about coaches and officials, the brunt of this is about athletes, and significantly female athletes. Once read through this entire article, and this article was put out by AP, and I'll start out by reading the intro to this just to give a little bit of groundwork. And so an NCAA study on social media abuse of athletes, coaches, and other officials during championship events found nearly 1 in 5 posts that were flagged by an AI-based algorithm and determined to be abusive, involving sexual harassment, and 12% were related to sports betting. And that's according to that study. So, I mean, for me, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, so since sports betting has been introduced in the NCAA, or at least being able to bet on NCAA games, it has really changed a lot of things when it comes to how people are interacting with athletes, specifically on the NCAA level, because of their parlay or of betting on them on the money line or whatever else. And I understand why all of these different schools want to get in on betting, right? It's another revenue stream. But I think what they're finding out is that it's detrimental to their student athletes and to their student athletes' mental health. If that's the way that, if that's kind of the double-edged sword, right? You earn more revenue through betting, and there's extra sponsorships that you get through betting. I mean, think about it. When you're watching a football game, even on a Sunday or a Saturday, DraftKings commercials are everywhere. You're getting DraftKings social media posts. You're getting DraftKings text messages. Like every little thing is about either, MGM bet or anything else, right? So sports betting has taken over to a grand extent. And what they're seeing already, as they did a study on it was the 2023 season that they conducted this entire study, is that sports betting is not having the best impact on the game. And a lot of people also want to point to NIL and how that's changed how athletes look at where they're going to schools. You need to also look at sports betting and how and point to and see how athletes are being interacted with from with coaches, fans, and referees, how these fans are interacting with them today. So Reed, jump in. What stuck out to you when you read through this article?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably confirmed a lot of the things that you could probably guess. I think anybody who's sort of in even a little bit of social media and kind of the public discourse, like women do tend to be disproportionately targeted in these things. It does a lot of times tend to revolve around their physical appearance. There's the betting piece of it is not surprising at all when I think about even my own friends that, watch and consume sports and things like that. I think a lot of it just comes down to two things come to mind for me. One is that it's not all that surprising, right? We've introduced, NIL, we've introduced a much more monetized way of consuming college sports. And I think that gives everyone, that feels like everyone has now this excuse essentially to kind of accessorize this aspect of life, right? You kind of dehumanizes the factor, just like we do for fantasy football, just like we do for sports betting and professional sports. Like they're tools and chess pieces and pawns and what we find in entertainment. And because they make money, we now all get to have some sort of ridiculous opinion about what they do, how they do, when they do, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's just extended into the college realm. I think where it gets a little tricky there is, you know, people see these kids as just an extension of a brand, right? You go watch an LSU. I remember going to watch LSU play Texas a couple of years ago, back when Burrow was on his undefeated run, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a kid cramps up, he gets hurt, he's down, trainers are in front of him. I've got a 50-year-old man 2 seats next to me dropping every profanity I've heard in my life at the guy because he's trying to cover his spread, and this guy he thinks is going to ruin his spread that he's trying to cover on this game. And like in that moment, you realize like, oh, that kid that is on the ground right now is a freshman. A year ago, his mom was driving him to his football games, probably, or his mom was making him dinner at the end of the day, asking him how his day went. And he was completely separate from this whole different thing that is now attached to him because he has LSU across his chest. And
Mm-hmm.
because he is in this sort of high monetized area. And that isn't to say that like all this stuff isn't allowed, right? Like, yeah, you're in the ecosystem, that stuff's going to be a thing, but to have no sort of consideration for the fact that these kids are 18, 19 a lot of times, and just now dipping their toes into being an individual and being an adult and not being protected by quite literally a school system and or their parents, is a little bit wild. I think if you were to step back and put that in a vacuum and say, this 50-year-old man is yelling at this 18-year-old kid because they didn't play a sport good, like
Mm-hmm.
that sentence is wild. But because we wrap it around the context of an LSU or a Texas or one of these other schools that we're essentially betting on, now it's okay. So that to me is interesting.
Yeah, and the amount of times that I have been on social media and I try and follow, not so much follow, but if I see a comment made, there's a tweet by somebody, I will go to the comments back to this tweet, right? I want to see how people are interacting. And the amount of times that you see, who cares? They're getting paid now. Like this comes with them getting paid. It's like, okay, so then let me come to your job and scream at you and degrade you and have an excuse because I'm paying for your services, that I get to treat you however the hell that I want, right? Like it's not an excuse to do that. And, you know, right now, I literally read this today and I was watching ESPN this morning and they were talking about the discourse that goes on between media coverage and how fans are now interacting and how the community, what the communities want to see. But it was sparked by LeBron James, as most things are during the basketball season. But he's going on a social media blackout. And when I was on social media, I was reading a couple of tweets and I was looking at a tweet from Jamel Hill, former ESPN reporter. And she was saying, I hope LeBron never comes back to this app, right? Hope he never comes back to Twitter. And probably a conversation for a different day, but a lot of people, sports media in general, are moving over to Blue Sky. I have a couple of friends that are journalists that are moving over to Blue Sky because it's just being policed sanely, I guess I should say. But that's probably a conversation for a different day between Blue Sky and Twitter. But somebody responded to her tweet saying, well, this is part of his job. Like you're engaging with the fans and it's unfiltered and this, that, and whatever. And it's like, no, people don't have to engage with you. It doesn't matter if it is Twitter or it's real life. If I don't want to engage with you, I don't engage with you. And it just comes down to the entitlement of fans now, where when they are betting on a game or they're paying, a certain amount of money to get into a game, that they feel the need to talk to these athletes, these coaches, these referees, however they want. And we've seen it a number of times with LeBron getting fans kicked out of games, where he will literally take a referee over, point to a fan that is most likely paid a lot of money because they're within arm's reach of LeBron James, and they're getting kicked out of a game. Russell Westbrook, exactly the same thing. I've seen it more in basketball, obviously, because those fans, it's a Coliseum feel. It's a lot less than football, where football players, they only hear you when they're on the sideline. They don't hear you when they're on the field, right? So it's a lot different there. But the entitlement of fans is starting to cross over from just social media into real life in that aspect where they feel entitled to do these things. We also saw it this year with Coach Franklin at Penn State, where he's walking off the field and he's talking to one of his players and he's within earshot of the fans. And there's a fan standing over top of him in the stands, and he's basically berating him and screaming at him. And Coach Franklin stops and he looks up at him and he says, "What's your name?" And he says, "You want to be a man and you want to talk to me like a grown man. Tell me what your name is." And the person walked away. And it just symbolized the fact that people think that there is this invisible shield where they have a right to say things to the people that they think are there to perform for them. And the internet gives them that shield. And then when they go out in public, they forget that that shield is no longer there. And they feel very entitled and they feel brave enough to stand up and say something to one of these athletes, to one of these coaches, or to one of these referees, forgetting that they're human. And, getting back to this article, there were 72,000 messages that were flagged. Over 5,000 of those posts were confirmed to contain abusive, discriminatory, or threatening content. And that's all that was reported to social media companies. That's just that small sample size. 72,000 messages that were flagged. Think about that. 72,000 messages were probably just posted as I'm saying this right now. So that's amount of messages that were probably posted within 1 second of being on social media, specifically on being on Twitter. So it's just an insane amount of harassment. And, on top of these things that people are harassing these players, they went in and the sports that this circulated around during 2023-2024 season were baseball, basketball, gymnastics, football, softball, and volleyball. And women's basketball in this report received a lot more. I think it says about 3 times more. Women's basketball students received approximately 3 times more threats than men's basketball students. And that's all around March Madness. 80% of the abuse in this study was directed at March Madness student athletes. That's incredible. So, I mean, we obviously pay attention to sports. When you look at March Madness, they're talking about the Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese saga that we all watched play out over these last couple of years. When they're talking about gymnastics, we saw the crowds that had gone to LSU for I don't even know if it was an LSU gymnastics meet, but it was LSU versus someone else, and might have been Oklahoma or something. And the crowd of boys that were there for Livy Dunn because they follow Livy Dunn, and the other girls couldn't even perform because anytime they were on any sort of routine, they're chanting, "We want Livy." Like it's disgusting is really what it is, to the point where athletes can't even truly be athletes because all these people feel entitled enough to degrade or cast aside whatever the hell they want because they feel that entitlement over these people like they are the chess pieces and the pawns that you talked about.
It's an interesting evolution in access and expectation, I feel like, because when I think about all the different ways, I mean, you and I are now at a point where, like, I remember growing up and watching, any athlete that I was a huge fan of. Twitter didn't exist. Really, social media in general didn't exist. And so your
Mm-hmm.
access to them was really just what you saw on ESPN or what you read in articles or what you saw, at the game or whatever it might have been. And it didn't affect my entertainment of the sport by any means. But as we've sort of peeled back these layers and given people more access, it's that whole, give somebody an inch, they're going to try and take a mile mentality. I feel like there's this, what is a privilege now becomes an expectation, was an expectation now gets abused. And it just sort of devolves from there, it feels like. And I think for a lot of people, they've never been in a position where they're on the receiving end of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's mob mentality. To your point, you got that many messages going out to certain people. Well, it can't be that bad. We're all saying it. Or they're not going to find me. I'm in this massive crowd. I can get this
Yeah.
off my chest. I can say what I want to say. And I'm not going to have that moment like that guy did at Penn State where someone turns around and says, "You want to tell me your name? You want to talk about it?" no one's really prepared to be on that end of it. And who knows, maybe that changed that guy's mentality on it. Maybe he went back home and tweeted something about him and, kept moving on or whatever. But I think specifically on the betting side, because I do think when we see the spikes, obviously March Madness, right? I've got to believe that, and it looks like, a good chunk of those messages that we see percentage wise come from that. You're you're not buying goods or services. You're betting. You're playing a game. Like you can get as
Mm-hmm.
upset as you want, but you guess wrong, right? You can't. The whole reason why betting exists and the whole reason why it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation is because nobody knows what's going to happen. So put your bet down. If you win, win like an adult. If you lose, lose like an adult. And to go online and to berate an 18 to 20-year-old kid for being who they are on any particular day, for me is an astounding thing to try and see. And I do think, you know, it's not surprising why women get it worse than men. I think that's, to be honest, kind of across the board, right? I mean, I've even
Mm-hmm.
seen how people talk to my wife at bars and in public settings, and then all of a sudden when I come rolling around and I'm a foot taller and I'm a guy and whatever else, the conversation changes. I wouldn't even consider myself an intimidating person, but all of a sudden now there's another factor in here. It's not a 5'2" woman, it's a 6'4" man, and all of a sudden the tone has changed. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people feel that same level of confidence or moxie or whatever, BS label you want to put on it in an online setting as well. And I don't understand it. I don't come from that background, and it's confusing for me to try and get there mentally, but clearly it's something that is a problem. And especially I think the statistic that was pretty shocking to me was when they flagged specifically sexual content as being sort of one of the harassment models on the women's
Mm-hmm.
side flags, 92% of that went towards female gymnasts. That's crazy to me. Now, and I think a factor of that is the fact that Livy Dunn has such a prominent individual reputation, right? She had that before she was at LSU. That's grown over time just with her ability to manage PR and really be quite the entrepreneur on that front. I think, can't, uniforms, athleticism, everything that goes into that. Again, I don't know why it makes people feel like they have the right to do that, but when you're behind a screen and no one's calling you out for it, what have you got to lose? I think is the mentality for a lot of people. And it's just a mob mentality. And I it's tricky because at the end of the day, the greatness of having that access to athletes and having that access to folks and being able to connect is the double-edged sword because every
Mm-hmm.
single thing that gets put on there, whoever is on the receiving end just has unfiltered access to it. It's like when we were kids and it was like, don't read the YouTube comments. But like
Yeah.
you are the YouTube video. Like, how do you not read the comment? Like it just is no wonder why we're having such an issue on the mental health sides of things in the NCAA. Of course
Yeah.
we are.
Yeah. And it's disgusting because it's gone even further than that, right? Where it's not just the sexual comments, but it's the racial ones too, right? And you know, I will be completely forthcoming in telling you, as an athlete, I have been called racial slurs. It has happened to me in my athletic career. But that was, and I'm not dismissing it and downplaying it because it was absolutely disgusting. But that was a couple of instances that happen on on a handful of nights, right? This is happening a millionfold over the internet, right? And part of this, the NCAA study found that toxic online fans resorted to racist mockery, comparing players to monkeys and calling and labeling them as thugs. So, and I'm going to call it what it is. I pay attention to what is happening when it came to this Angel Reese versus Caitlin Clark saga and the vitriol that was being the racial vitriol that was being hurled at Angel Reese because she dared to be outspoken as well as good at basketball, right? And that is crossed over into the WNBA, which we saw last week or last year. It's disgusting, is what it is, um, and then move from that to what happens with Jason Kelsey. Jason Kelsey's at Penn State. and he's getting essentially chased down by a guy that thought it was okay to say something to this very large man who used to battle people in basic hand-to-hand combat for a living, and Jason reacted. The guy wanted a response and he got a response. Now, in response to that, there were think tanks and people like us that were discussing it. But one of the best comments that I had seen from it was from Eagles Super Bowl champion Chris Long. I'm going to read this. He said, "The internet culture has ruined real life, and there's too many people who grew up in situations where they never got punched in the face." And I do not condone violence whatsoever outside of sport, right? I was a boxer, I was an MMA fighter. Certainly there's violence in that. There's violence in football as well. There's violence in wrestling. So basically, every sport that I have played, there's violence that comes with it. But I do not condone violence whatsoever. But I will say that being in situations growing up where there was an actual threat of danger of getting into a childlike fight changes your mentality on a lot of these things. Nowadays, kids are on FaceTime or they have screen time where they've got iPads and they're playing games where they're just hurling racial epithets at people from all across the world. There's no significant consequence unless they're caught by their parents or unless somebody records it and puts it out on social media, which has become the ultimate F around and find out. But I feel like we are in that constant level of I'm going to just say or do whatever it is I want to do. And maybe I will get consequences, but the consequences are not thought of. And everybody wants to say that they're doing it in the guise of free speech, but free speech comes with consequences. You can say whatever you want, but if somebody wants to punch you in the face over it, they're going to punch you in the face over it. Right. And like I said, I'm not condoning any of that, but you do not control how somebody responds to you being an idiot or to you attacking them through any of the dumb stuff that you say. Um, I just hope that the discourse between athletes and fans gets cleaned up, but I don't see that happening anytime soon because of the outright stupidity that is in the world right now when it comes to fan interactions and how they just feel so emboldened by the fact that they can be a nameless and faceless figure on social media. And that's disgusting, but it's the world we live in now.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head too. I agreed. I don't condone. I don't want anybody to get beat up. I don't want anybody to get punched, obviously. But I think now, like when we were growing up, if I had to say something to somebody, I had to say something to somebody, and they had an ability to do something about that, and that taught me very immediate consequences for how I wanted to manage situations. I feel like now kind of like you mentioned, the worst thing that can really happen is you get canceled, essentially, which don't get me wrong,
Mm-hmm.
like not great, like not a good, but like to me, all that teaches people is how to have a really good public face and then how to
Yeah.
hide the vitriol effectively, right? Through a
Mm-hmm.
burner account or through something like it doesn't teach you true consequences. It just teaches you how to better avoid consequences, in my mind. So that I think is just an interesting, maybe we can't even call it a generational shift in some of that. I say that. People that I'm seeing are old dudes that know you can get hit in the face and still do it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, that is an interesting shift in that whole piece of the puzzle. But yeah, I don't. I'm at a loss for. I don't see a world where it gets better only because I think similar to like politics and everything else, like the more kind of discourse there is, the more content there is. The more content there is, the more the powers that be that are involved in this space don't have to work hard to find other things to talk about, right? I mean, like we just the other day, I heard another person reference like Michigan State, like punching each other in the alleyway back in the big house. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's just because there's every day probably you could Google the name Livy Dunn, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and find some article about somebody saying something getting posted, something getting shit. Like it's such the low hanging fruit on that kind of stuff, and we as a culture love drama, for lack of a better term. And it's why CNN and Fox and BBC and pick your poison will sit up top and say this, we need to find a solution. We need to work, but like they love that everyone hates each other. Like
Mhm.
that's just because that's what keeps people coming back and reading their stuff and consuming their stuff, right? So, I mean, you're kind of working against everybody in that sense. That's the problem.
Yeah, and on that point, like I said, I was watching ESPN this morning, and it was Stephen A. on First Take, and he's talking with Brian Windhorst, and they were discussing the LeBron situation, and Stephen A. pointed to why so much drama is covered, and he said we can put out a piece where we are discussing a great feel good story, and then we can put out a piece where we are discussing the drama between Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, and the drama piece will get so many more views and clicks and shares than this feel good story over here of a kid, coming up from hard times and getting to the NBA and getting his family out of a tough situation. And the reason being is because people like drama, they like conflict. So the media, in response to that, is going to put together a drama fest because it keeps the views coming. So even though it seemed like he was skirting responsibility and his culpability in the coverage, he was also right in the fact that as media figures, we look at the numbers. And if I see that when I push this button, you watch it, as opposed to when I push this other button, you don't, I'm going to continue to push this button over here a lot more than the one over here, which got some views, but didn't so much go viral. Right. And like I said, the media is culpable with that, but you have to listen to your audience. And some of the best data that you get is the data where you're seeing those numbers go up and to the right, but it's also in when you aren't seeing those numbers go up and to the right. It's what your audience isn't telling you. And that's how I interpret the data as a journalist, as a content creator of these people want to listen and they want to see. They can't look away from the car crash. I watched that Mike Tyson fight the other night on Netflix and I could not look away. It was an absolute car crash, but I could not look away. And that is what I feel like a lot of people were like, we want to see how Mike looks at 58 years old. But once we got into it, we were all in it together. I highly doubt a lot of people turned it off, even with streaming issues and everything else, because they wanted to see the drama unfold. They just couldn't look away. And I feel like
Mhm.
that's what people gravitate towards. And now people are they're trying to manufacture their own drama when it comes to the vitriol and everything else that they're bringing into the conversation on social media with these athletes. And to wrap up, I want to give the numbers, and I'll link the article in the comments so that people who are listening to this can read the article and they can take a look at the numbers themselves. But 18% of all the abusive comments were sexual, and they were targeted towards both male and female. But and then 12% of all the abuse was related to sports betting, with more than 740 instances. 10% of the abuse consisted of racial content. 9% of the abuse was homophobic or transphobic. 6% of the abuse, and approximately 380 instances, was violent. And then 80% of the abuse in the study was directed at March Madness and March Madness student athletes. And as we said, that was 3 times more on the women's side than the men's side. So these numbers are disgusting. They really are. And if you can't draw the correlation between the fantasy aspect of it with fan interaction, I don't know what to tell you. But as sports betting has been introduced in college sports, you've seen these things increase. Reed, what are your final thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to have the same approach to this as I do with people like that I know that worked in the service industry. Like you should have to you should have to be on the receiving end of this. You have to work in the service industry for a month before you can have an opinion on service industry. You should have to, at the very least, like you should have to meet with a student athlete on a team you're going to bet for and ask them what their day looks like. Ask them why they start at 4 a.m. so that they can get breakfast in before a lift. Ask them how they fit in 15 hours of classes in between the 3-hour block window a day that they have beside, outside of their 2-hour practice and their 2-hour required study hall. And now probably their NIL requirements in order to, keep whatever it is they have, go and talk to somebody to kind of just, if nothing else, humanize the situation. But I think a lot of people don't want to do that. I think they like the idea that it is an accessory and a thing that they can just sort of pay attention to. So in a perfect world, just humanize the process and let's all be a little bit nicer to each other.
Yeah. Obviously, you and I have the unique standing of being former athletes and knowing what it's like to be under a microscope, not quite to the extent that the Caitlin Clarks or the Shadur Sanders or the, any of the, or Livy Dunns, not to that extent, but even the little bit that we did have throughout our careers is enough to know these people are human. They're going to mess up on the field. They're going to mess up on the court. It's going to happen. It is our job as fans to support them. Yeah, I can see being critical, but don't be critical to the point where you become part of this 80% of people or the 18 or 12% of people that are doing it. So, hopefully we start to see a shift as people are shaking things up when it comes to the social media platforms that they partake in. I read a study that said that a lot of the sports media is shifting from Twitter to Blue Sky. So we'll see what that brings. Obviously, things on Facebook are a little bit different as well. So it really is a pick your poison kind of a thing. And just knowing how much screen time is too much screen time. But I love that the NCAA did look into this. I love that they put out a statement that was part of this article that said that they are looking into doing the things that they can do to fix it and to remedy this situation. Hopefully we do see things start to make a better turn because athletes' mental health is on the line. And would you rather have a game to watch and bet on, or would you rather see that athlete sidelined because of all the crap that you wanted to hurl at them, you and the other 80% of people wanted to hurl at them because they messed up during a game, right? So, hopefully these things do change. And when they do, we'll be here to talk about it. So, Reed, as always, I appreciate you joining me for another topic so we can dig in on this. Appreciate everyone for listening in to the A2A podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe, put a comment below, and we will see you next time here on the Athletes Podcast.